I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, it is St. Francis time all the time over here in my apartment. I can't stop thinking about this weird Italian character, this goofy guy, ever since we started talking about him on the podcast, I don't know, a few months ago now. I feel like he keeps creeping in. And I think even though our listeners might be tired of St. Francis, I am really not. And with your permission, as my perennial co-host, I'd like to talk about him again for a whole nother hour, but from a different angle. How does that sound?
Yeah, St. Francis himself was not a fan of rules guiding monastic life, and in a similar way, I think that you don't even need to ask me permission. You can just do it. You just talk about it.
That's right. Well, I was trying to be humble in a true Franciscan way, humiliating myself before my superior.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We've been talking about St. Francis a lot on the show, and I do think that there's some kind of reason that he keeps coming up. Matt and I have been talking about lots of other themes like degrowth and climate change and ecology and eco-socialism and all that stuff for a while. And I think St. Francis is just a character that lends toward all of that. He is a person in Christian history who tries to bring those themes together in an interesting way. And you kind of can't, it's hard to run out of topics or people talking about Francis. And just a few weeks ago, we did this history of St. Francis looking at post-Marxist thinkers and what they have to say about him. A while back, we did an episode on Francis and kind of what Marxists had to say. This week, though, we decided maybe we should stop going outside the tradition and find somebody inside talking about St. Francis, in particular, Leonardo Boff. Boff is a liberation theologian who you've probably heard about on the show in the past. A few weeks ago, we did an episode on Clodovus Boff, his brother, and we'll probably talk more about him in this episode at some point as well. Leonardo Boff was a Franciscan himself, and in 1982, he's still alive, by the way, I just say was because he's not a priest anymore. He left the priesthood. But in 1982, he wrote a book called St. Francis, A Model for Human Liberation, that picks up on some of the characteristics that Marxists kind of like about St. Francis, but it adds a lot more spiritual content that's obviously missing in Marxist takes or is just not of interest to Marxist writers for understandable reasons, I guess. Boff also wrote a few other books about St. Francis. He wrote an interesting book in the early 2000s called The Prayer of St. Francis, which is a commentary on that prayer. He wrote a book called Francis of Assisi and Francis of Rome, or maybe it's the other way around, but about St. Francis and Pope Francis. And we talked about his book, The Cry of the Earth, The Cry of the Poor, a while back, where Francis is a big deal. So Francis is important to Boff. And we thought, we were talking about St. Francis through all these other lenses. Why don't we just go to somebody who's actually been a member of the community that St. Francis founded and see what they have to say about it. So we read this great book, and here we are to tell you all about it for the next hour.
That's great. There's nothing you can do to escape but pause the podcast. And you wouldn't do that, so you're stuck with us. Right. So again, the book is called St. Francis, A Model for Human Liberation. You can go to archive.org and look it up, and you can borrow the book there and read it on your computer. or you can find the crustiest used bookstore, and hopefully they have a copy of this great old Orbis book. It's a cool one though, for sure. So in Boff's book on St. Francis, he makes the argument that St. Francis is a good model for the aims of liberation theology. So that, liberation theology, it's great, we love it, but if you want to be a person practicing liberation theology, you should think about St. Francis and how he approaches the world, I think, generally. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one for sure. There's a lot of like Francis is probably most associated with like voluntary poverty and renouncing private property and all that kind of stuff. But I think that just like the general comportment toward the world is actually even more difficult than those things. Francis offers a whole different way of thinking about enemies and ecology, wolves, birds, all of it, man. It's tough. A lot of tough lessons in here that I think are really worthwhile, but definitely are hard for your brain to readjust to. But anyways, as Boff tells the story, St. Francis is a type of revolutionary character. He's not a reformist, he's a revolutionary. Boff makes this claim really explicitly. And he's a revolutionary because he has a utopian vision of what Christianity could look like, and he's trying to like lead people toward that particular vision. In his evangelization towards regular people, but also through like other sort of more monastic types of people. Something I didn't know about St. Francis actually before I picked this up is that for at least a part of the time that he was out and about in the world, he was not like he wasn't a priest. He wasn't like a person of the church. He was just like a lay person, just vibing out in the world.
Yeah, he was never a priest. He became a deacon, but that's debatable. But in the tradition, he becomes a deacon, but still never a priest.
Yeah, I think that part is like really interesting to me. That he's just a layperson, just like vibing and like taking up these vows of poverty, and then it all gets sucked up into the church proper. Anyways, a pretty interesting thing. All that being said, though, in this episode, we're going to talk about Boff's take on Francis and figure out if St. Francis really is the model for Christians doing liberation theology. I think that he is up front, but there's some pretty considerable tensions to think through as well. But we'll get to them all here in a little bit.
Yeah, maybe one last place setting bit here too. I think it's really interesting that Boff is writing this pitch. He's a Franciscan writing about St. Francis. That part's not surprising. But liberation theology really was developed in a big way by a lot of members of religious orders, people in religious communities. And in terms of some of the theological voices, you might think of people like Gustavo Gutierrez or Fray Beto. They're both Dominicans, for example. Or you could think of Fernando Cardenal, Ernesto Cardenal's brother, who was a Jesuit. Or people like Ignacio Ellacuría, who was also a Jesuit. John Sobrino's a Jesuit. So lots of different religious folks. And there's something about religious communities, maybe we said this in a previous episode, but they kind of preserve the community aspect of the church and what you could call a certain communist vision of the church. In the Augustinian rule, for example, that you get sort of taken up again by Dominic in the Dominican rule, there is the sort of formula in Acts of not having possessions and sharing with people who have need and so on. That's like built into the rule of community life. So there's an interesting kind of thing going on there. And Boff is trying to make the pitch that Francis, out of all these saints, is the one who could, be the model. And I think it's very funny because, as far as I know, maybe I could be wrong, but I don't think people like Gutierrez wrote a book about how, St. Dominic should be the model, or like Ellacuría wasn't suggesting that Ignatius should be the model or something. So maybe Boff just wins because he was the only religious willing to be like, actually, it was my saint that should be the model. But I do think that he offers a pretty compelling case that there's something really interesting happening with St. Francis as a predecessor in medieval or late medieval, early capitalist Italy, something that Francis is intuiting and doing that sort of has a resonance with what liberation theologians in Latin America are intuiting and doing. And like you said, Matt, there's some frictions there, but I think it's a pretty good pitch coming out of, a person who's actually living in religious life.
Totally. And with Boff, we were talking about this before we got started. Boff is not really like... not the systemic thinker like Clodovis Boff, his brother. He is definitely just a guy who's like kind of throwing stuff together, and if it works, it works. and it's great. I'm here for it. I'm here for it because I think it works in this occasion. All right.
Franciscan vibe.
Yeah, a very Franciscan vibe, I think. So before we get to talking about how St. Francis himself fits into like the idea of liberation theology, Boff takes some time and just describes what liberation theology is and like what it's after. Here it is. He thinks that liberation theology has two principal tasks. The first one is to point out the theological relevance of freedom movements. Historical liberation is never just historical. There is in it objectively grace or sin independent of the interests of the actors or ideological signs that they inspire. In other words, salvation and the kingdom of God are realized objectively within these processes. Great. And the second task of liberation theology, we'll talk about them both here in 1 second. But the second task is that liberation theology deals with the liberating aspects that are present in the gospel, in the life and praxis of Jesus, and in the great tradition of the church. Faith is salvific only when it's translated into a practice of love. So here you go. The two pieces of liberation theology, all boiled down, if you had to, are that there's something theologically relevant and like a sort of like revelatory practice in historical movements of liberation. God's present in them is maybe the first thing. And the second is that like in the gospel, you'll find in the gospel and in the tradition of the church, both those things, I guess, need to go together. There's like a liberating ethic that you can find, and one that I think has a lot to do with Francis. I don't know, Dean, you're the liberation theology guy. What do you think about these two explanations?
I think they're great. He's right. It's a good word. There's something else that he sort of adds on to this, or maybe by way of clarifying the first point that really struck me too, and that I made a note of in the book. So when he's talking about how liberation theology tries to find the theological relevance of those kind of liberation struggles, he goes on to say, the kingdom is made present and is anticipated to the degree to which these processes are ethically defensible. That is, they signify the creation of true and better meaning. This perspective allows the rereading of the liberation movements of past centuries and of the secular culture resulting from them as theologically relevant, although they have not been supported by the church, and although in some cases, like the Socialist and Workers' Revolution, they have taken a position contrary to Christianity. Grace and the kingdom do not find in the church exclusive mediators, but rather privileged ones on a sacramental order. And I think that is a really interesting point, and maybe something that has attracted us to liberation theology on this podcast, that there's something about the willingness to affirm that even if a revolution it isn't just maybe unsupported by the church, but is even actively against it, there's still a kind of theological way of understanding those liberation movements that tries to sort of not see liberation as like something that Christians have a monopoly over or something, but it's something that all Christians should be interested in, whether it's sort of done in a Christian spirit or not. And that, I think, is a really lasting contribution of liberation theology to sort of knock down those walls of maybe hard divides between like there's secular liberation on the one hand, and then there's kind of Christian faithfulness on the other. Liberation theology is trying to create a theological way of reflecting on the huge human struggle for liberation, whether it looks Christian or not. And I think that's a really just a point worth making over and over, right? That Christians are able to engage liberation struggles and metabolize them, not to baptize them or something, but to be able to see something similar in those struggles, as contradictory as it might seem.
Yeah, actually, I really like that point a lot. In my more academic days when I was in Christian higher ed, a phrase that would get thrown around a lot in, I don't know, tense moments maybe of disagreement would be that all truth is God's truth. And people usually meant that to somehow reconcile like particular scientific facts with fundamentalist readings of the Bible, so that people would get less mad about them or something, right? But I think actually it makes a lot more sense to use that type of phrase in this particular paradigm, right? Not about science, but about the immortal science of Marxism, right? That even in liberation movements, even if they are like against the church, there's a kernel of truth in them. There's something revelatory about what the kingdom of God might look like within them. You gotta just look at it the right way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe one last quote here, and then we'll talk about St. Francis, but just to get the liberation theology part on the table some more. Boff goes on to say, the big question that challenges Christians in every poor area is how to be true Christians, how to announce the joy of universal fraternity, because we're all children of the Heavenly Father in a world of wretches and exploited. We can only be so, in fact, if we live Christian faith in terms of human advancement and liberation. Faith essentially is not exhausted by these expressions, but it would not be a true faith nor the faith of Christ in the apostles if it did not include liberation from misery, meaning dehumanization and an offense to God himself. It has to do with a liberating evangelization, urging a Christian practice that implies also a transformation of society, helping to form a new humanity within socio-historical structures that result in greater fraternity. This fundamentally is what is proposed by liberation theology. You might want to pick on this or that phrase in that paragraph, but I think that is a great way of summing up liberation theology, that there is not just that liberation struggles add something interesting to Christianity, but that if you really want to sort of think about how to evangelize or announce the joy of universal fraternity in a world of exploitation, then you actually kind of have to find a way to get into the conversation around human advancement and liberation. I think that is also a really neat way to sort of create a space to then talk about somebody like St. Francis of Assisi, somebody who is also wandering through an Italy where there are wretches and exploited people, and someone who's also interested in liberation in many different dimensions.
I think that this particular language about universal fraternity ends up being a really big deal for this whole book, for people who want to think about Francis and people who are thinking about liberation theology. And I think it's worth kind of pulling it out here at the beginning of this conversation because, okay, I mean, Francis fundamentally thinks, I mean, you can just kind of see it in the way that he talks, right? Everyone is a brother, everyone is a sister, everyone is a non-binary sibling. Francis doesn't think that necessarily, but I think that, so it's fine. But it does. There's a type of ethic in there that I think is really great, and I like it. But also one that's very challenging in the sense that like it does draw a tension between the Franciscan ethic and also liberation theology and Marxism, because it's hard to have a universal fraternity or believe that there's a universal fraternity of all people when also you believe in the class war or something, right? I mean, there are ways to kind of make these ideas work together, and I think that actually there's a way that Francis kind of gives us some tools to think through that. But it's also just one of those tensions. I think that's late in the conversation, and fine, we'll deal with it in a minute, maybe. But I want to make everyone aware this tension exists, and you should be feeling it.
Yeah, it's maybe there's something about that too that manifests in some of the religious orders. Like you get the Jesuits who are really committed to social justice, and maybe there's something about that because all the way back to Ignatius, there's this really active component in the faith. Ignatius himself was a soldier, and he was very like invested in higher ed and learning, or at least the order became invested in it. And the same with Dominic and the Dominicans. There's this commitment to learn as much as you can and then sort of spread the word of God in this way that for liberation theology or Dominican liberation theologians ended up being like, they're all really into reading Karl Marx, right? Like, or you get the same with like Herbert McCabe, there's something kind of baked into that religious tradition. You don't get the same thing in the Franciscans. There are other Franciscans who are in the mix in liberation theology for sure. The order itself is found in a lot of struggles, and I always think of a guy named Uriel Molina, who was a Franciscan in Nicaragua and a Sandinista, a really important base community leader in Managua. So you had like Ernesto Cardenal, he was out doing the rural stuff in Solentiname. Molina was like the cardinal of the cities, the urban cardinal, you could say. He was a Franciscan, but eventually also had to leave the order over tensions within the order and the revolution and everything. But there is something about Francis that makes him an ambivalent character when it comes to social revolution, right? Like, we'll probably talk about this some more, but because he's a peacemaker, you don't get the same sort of, I don't know, like prophetic indignation that you might get with a Dominican or a Jesuit. I mean, Leonardo Boff obviously finds it. He has a real prophetic indignation, but it's maybe harder to find, or Boff has to like maybe do some extra work to like discover that peace, because Francis is such a like peaceful, humble guy, you know, not conflict averse, but not committed to conflict in the same way.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think that there's definitely a way towards that that prophetic voice within the Franciscan way of thinking, but it takes a few extra steps to get there. But let's bracket that off for now. So before we get there, let's talk about the type of church and sort of like situation that Francis kind of comes to be in. I think that's an important part of the story. Francis is born into a world that is, you know, pre-capitalist, more or less. But Boff notes that during Francis's life, a lot of things are changing rapidly, and Christianity is changing along with it. So this is from Boff that I think kind of helps explain what's happening. What can a church immersed in power and preoccupied with maintaining dominion over the world say to a new Christendom, born of the villages and merchant activity? Practically nothing. There's a vacuum of official leadership because until then, the Christian religion was feudal and not bourgeois, rural and not urban. It would have been necessary to have an evangelization of the people that was based on the witness of poverty and that had gospel roots, and not in the reiteration of common doctrine elaborated by imperial religious power. Only thus would a minimum of credibility be safeguarded and a fitting religious meaning be developed for the situation. So Francis is like an interesting character because there's a sort of like transformation going on, right? Of like rural to urban and that whole type of thing from like a feudal society towards a more bourgeois society, right? The birth of a type of capitalism and like merchant activity and stuff, right? We could get into the like economics of the whole situation, but like let's not for a hot minute. The important piece here that Boff is trying to draw out, though, is that particular type of church in this moment, like it has nothing to really to say to like the urban poor, to the growing sort of proletarianized classes. And Francis is like not of the church that is he's not of like that feudal church, right? There's something else that he's doing. Francis's religious vocation is that of like a layperson, though he, you know, later becomes a deacon. I think like we talked about already. But Francis's practice of Christianity and emphasis on liberty and fraternity shared in a particular moment of many other movements within Christianity at the time that people found like really compelling. So there are people like the Waldensians or the Brethren of the Free Spirit, all religious organizations that the Waldensians and the Brethren of the Free Spirit and a whole bunch of others that sort of fall in this category of like free spirit. That's like the maybe grouping. They're all really anti-clerical and kind of anti-Catholic Church, but religious in a different way. But Francis is kind of associated with those types of things because of the emphasis on fraternity and the emphasis on liberty, but he's not anti-clerical in the way the others were, problematically so sometimes. So that's like kind of situating Francis within this larger conversation that he's involved in this, like, you know, being and bearing witness to the proletarianization of workers, of people, the transformation of society towards a capitalist economy, and like trying to figure out what it means to be like authentically Christian. Just like the quote that Dean read from Boff earlier, like what does it mean to be a poor person and trying to live out Christianity? That's what Francis is trying to do during this particular, you know, moment of transition. And that's why he ends up looking, you know, so different than I think other particular characters within the story of the church.
Right. You have on St. Francis's one side the church hierarchy, which represents this outgoing social order, and Boff even sometimes does his own kind of gloss on the Gramsci line that the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born, and there's all kinds of stuff that happens in between. So you have the church on the one side with this outgoing feudal order, and then you have on the other side a bourgeois class, which Francis is from, right? His dad is super rich, and Francis renounces his wealth. And then maybe on like on another side, a third side, if you will, there's these kind of radical currents, like Matt's talking about, these more millenarian or mystical utopian currents that are definitely outside the church. And Francis is such an interesting guy because he's like trying to sort of do something different from all three of these parties, and also is sort of related to them in complicated ways. And what I like about Boff's examination of Francis's context is Boff says, all right, I'm a liberation theologian. I'm really interested in systemic change, systemic critique, and so on. But he says that kind of mindset wouldn't have been available to St. Francis. And sometimes St. Francis gets painted as a reformist character, or like I don't know, he's not the true radical in the way the Waldensians were the real radicals, and Francis is a compromise. And we've talked about that a bunch on the show as well in the past. That's kind of the Marxist reading too. But Boff says just because he doesn't have that same radicalism and doesn't maybe have the same systemic language, it doesn't mean that he's not a radical in his own right. So here's how he puts it. We ought to point out that Francis was a great revolutionary, not a mere reformer. The reformer continues to be an agent of the system, reproducing it by means of the correction of abuses and the introduction of reforms. In an analytical sense, revolutionary means a creative fantasy to plan and to live something not yet shown. Extremely funny, by the way, to say that's the analytical sense of the term revolutionary.
Yeah. not what I would guess, but okay.
Francis, revolutionary, began to walk his own path. He himself confesses in his testament, "No one showed me what I should do." But what he does represents, on the one hand, a radical criticism of the dominant forces of the time, and on the other, a strong response to the demands of the situation. So what you get in Francis is a kind of performative critique. And Boff goes on to say, seen from the point of view of a system that defines what is possible and what is not, what is sensible and what is not, the path of Francis seems like foolishness. And Francis, of course, famously embraces that, right? He's supposed to be a fool. So there's something about that that's really compelling. And in particular, it's a new way of living together for Boff. That's the innovation of Francis, the revolutionary moment. It's not like Francis is just a weirdo, and that's like the thing that the system can't contain. It's an affirmation of a certain kind of community bound together in poverty, giving itself over to the world in this different way, or giving itself over to the poor of the world and to creation. And I think that there's something to it. Like, it is tempting to read St. Francis as the compromise candidate of medieval radicals or whatever, the guy who gets sucked back into the church machine, and then, his order becomes full of people who also kind of betray that vision. But I think I'm sold. Boff has sold me. Francis is more revolutionary than people tend to think, and it is all sort of premised on that community, that vision of universal fraternity.
I agree. The Waldensians and the Free Spirit folks, they're interesting for sure, and it's like they're interesting people to learn about, but also really problematic in a lot of ways. Go read about them. I don't know. It's a wild trip for sure. I think though, okay, so there's this way that Francis is, like you're saying, Dean, like kind of giving himself over to the poor of the world, and there's a way that Francis negotiates power that is really important to understand and to figure out exactly what he's kind of doing in that, and like why the poverty part is so important, and how that relates to how he thinks about liberation and what it means to be a free person. So this is another quote from this part, kind of explaining Francis, and I think it's a little bit long, but it's worth kind of figuring out. So this is Boff again, kind of talking about liberation and what freedom means for Francis. He says that he is presented as a man liberated from the ties of the different systems. This consciousness is manifested in the dispute with his father, who went to the consuls of Assisi to force Francis to return the money that he had distributed among the poor. They asked him to appear before them, and Francis answers, "By the grace of God, I'm free, and I'm not obligated to obey the consuls, because I am a servant of the Most High God."
It's like, my favorite country song, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. I love this is great though. I love this rationale. Like, sorry, I serve God, and I don't have to do what you say. Is extremely funny. That's like me when I was 17, and I've grown out of it, maybe in a bad way. The consul said to the father, "Seeing that your son is in service of God, it's not up for us to judge him." Come on. A real weak-willed consul. Come on. I don't think that's okay. You guys got to fight a little bit harder than that. All right. So finally, it says, this is Boff's concluding kind of point in the story. This way out from power is a form of liberation for Francis. So in rejecting material, and rejecting power, and rejecting like his like sort of inheritance and giving it to the poor, there's like a type of foolishness, right? This is the where the Saint Francis talks about himself as, right? He's this he's a new fool in the world. That's what God wants him to be like. But it is a type of foolishness, and it is a type of like, personal ethic that I think is like in line with the gospel in a particular hermeneutic way of reading, and I like it. But it's also like it's saying like I don't want power, and like that in itself is liberating, and it's like that stepping back from the whole system and like ways that things work that's the moment of liberation of is Francis saying like I'm not doing this thing that you want me to do, and I'm just sorry, I'm a free person. I'm not going to do it. it's very hard to get your mind around, I think, in some ways, because it's like, saying that you saying that you don't want power is like doesn't feel like liberating necessarily, but I think that there's a particular way of spinning this that it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's what gets somebody like Giorgio Agamben, everybody's favorite problematic Italian philosopher. It's what makes him so invested in the Franciscans and St. Francis in particular, that there's this St. Francis is like becoming ungovernable, right? He's like, you can't govern me by worldly authorities, because actually I follow the deeper logic of creation, the rule by God and God alone. And there is something about that that's really empowering. It's the willingness to suspend all those other systems, all those other forms of governance that are kind of swirling around. And I think that there is something really compelling about it. It's tough to find the systemic link. And it's important too to contextualize it in the life of community, because the goal is not to become like a rogue radical individual, but to really commit to a community of free people. But there's something about it that does feel really, liberating, right? Like when your dad sues you to be like, I don't actually like that you gave all this money to the poor, and you're just like, sorry, Dad, like I don't know what to tell you. That's just what I'm supposed to do because God told me to do it. That is like a sign of true freedom, right? He's not bound by the law of the land, but also not even bound by the law of his dad. Exactly, not bound by dad law. That's true freedom.
Yeah, I think it's great. My son, he's little, he's 8, and sometimes, people will tease him or whatever, something that will happen at school. And I always tell him, like the thing that you need to do is show people that like you don't play by their rules and you don't care what they say. And sort of this like sense of like rejecting the whole system of being teased in the playground as a concept, and then you can't be teased, right? And it's exactly the same thing that's going on here. Francis' dad's mad at him because he's giving all this money away, but Francis is just like, sorry, I don't do any of this. No thanks. You can't make me.
Some real Franciscan parenting. So when he's being teased on the playground, he can just be like, sorry, I only serve the true God, and that God doesn't care about your extremely weird 8-year-old social rules.
Well, okay. I mean, first of all, that, but also if you're being bullied by people, you should go tell the teacher, and that's really important. But
yeah.
But like in this like sort of metaphor though, the teacher is God, and like you play by the teacher's rules, not by the kids. And okay.
The metaphor is really falling apart. I'm sorry I added even one more layer to it. Let's go to the other thing Boff does say, though, about that community. So the key, like I said, is not that Francis finds his own internal liberation, but that he establishes a community that is equal, a kind of radical equality, as Boff puts it. And he goes through a bunch of kind of quotes from Francis talking about the way that power gets inverted in the community. But the real key is that you only really find your power within the fraternity, the Franciscan fraternity, by giving up your power, by working with others, by trying to make yourself a servant to the people around you. And the way Boff describes it is Francis is revolutionizing these different relationships. And he also adds that it's not just an internal kind of thing, but the internal relationship of equality allows the Franciscans to also be outwardly present. So he says the fraternity opens outward. When they go out into the world, the brothers are to behave evangelically, living poorly, proclaiming peace, eating what is placed before them, avoiding any form of violence, giving whatever is asked of them, right? It's the kind of thing that is like a truly free way of life. And when I read that, I actually couldn't help but think of like the kind of thing that Nietzsche even is talking about in a different way. I mean, Nietzsche would probably hate St. Francis, but because St. Francis is all about being little and humble and a loser on purpose. But there is something there that like Nietzsche's whole thing is that the truly free person doesn't really need anybody or doesn't really need anything because they're sort of at home with themselves and in the world. And in Francis, you get, I guess, this kind of like, inner strength that is somewhat similar to that, but it's the kind of thing that is premised on the fact that you are committed to the fraternity, that you're committed to the others in such a way that you can then individually kind of live without grasping. You can release your debts. You can sort of forget whatever is like clinging to you, because that's your true strength is found in that community of peace. And I think there's something really, really energizing and challenging about that way of life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, right before that quote that you read too, there's another part that I thought was really interesting. Earlier on, I was talking about the tensions between like the Franciscan ethic and also like the idea of class war or something. And I feel like you see some of that tension here in an interesting way. So Boff, he kind of quoting Francis, writes, "In the rifts and failures of community, the medicine is always the spirit of fraternity." And then this is the quote from Francis. "So do not worry or fret about the sin or bad example of others, admonishing him, instructing him, and correcting him humbly and diligently, as best befits them according to God." I guess that the tension here I see is that like, when your boss is exploiting you or whatever, it's like, don't worry or fret about that. But that's the tension. But there's a step beyond this though, where like instructing him, correcting him humbly and diligently maybe is like the is a very weak way of being indignantly prophetic or something. But anyways, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there's like a perceived tension between class struggle and like that would happen in your workplace on any given day, and the Franciscan way of thinking about the world. But also, I think that there is like there's a different type of comportment that you might carry where you doing class struggle from this like Franciscan sort of perspective. Mm-hmm. Thinking about even the bourgeoisie as your brothers, unfortunately, your brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings. That's what they are to you, and you're trying to correct them in one way or another. But whether or not they'll listen is a different story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe that's kind of where I found the most use in Boff's presentation of Francis as well. Is it's just like in McCabe's essay on the class struggle and Christian love, he has that great passage where he says, "The Sermon on the Mount should make you a good comrade," right? It makes you a reliable person in the struggle. And there's something about Franciscan spirituality that's that way too, right? It's like St. Francis's great combat liberalism piece. You should be at peace with everybody and be willing to humbly correct the person in your fraternity. But there's something bigger than that too. There's this kind of fundamental faith that at the end of the day, even if you are alienated from somebody via something like a class war, or in Francis's day, a literal war, right? Like he was also in a time of lots of violence. That you should still see that particular person or even that group as fundamentally your responsibility. And I think there's something about that that's pretty compelling. There's a great story in here that Boff tells about a situation where there were these robbers and thieves, and they were like coming down and stealing stuff. And Francis's advice was to first like go out to where the robbers are and bring like some bread and wine and be like, "Hey, you robbers, come on down. We brought you some bread and wine. We don't really want anything from you. You can just have this for free." And then give it to them and just like let them go on their way and just tell them, "Hey, next time you rob somebody, just like don't hurt them. How about that?" And then the next day come back and bring like maybe some nicer stuff, even some better wine or whatever, and just be super nice and friendly to them and like let it go on their way. And the key is, Francis says, basically don't judge them, because like they're probably robbing for some particularly good reason, right? Maybe that's like the seed of the the social theory of crime or something that you get in St. Francis. And then finally, they go back a third time, And again, through that kind of kindness and meekness, they're having this exchange. And Francis is like, who knows? Maybe even one of them will be Franciscan. But the whole point is actually not to get them to like stop robbing people. And I think that is like really interesting. You know, like on the one hand, they're your enemies. They could rob you, and wouldn't that be bad? Or they're robbing other people, and isn't that bad? But for St. Francis, there's also a sort of affirmation that even the robbers have some kind of humanity. And the key is to be like creative enough to sort of find the way of pulling somebody over on your side. And Boff goes out of his way to say that it's not like a third way politics. It's not like, oh, there's the ruling class on the one hand and the revolutionaries on the other, and like we just have to find the liberal way out of the situation. It's on the contrary. It's like, what's the kind of revolutionary means by which we would build a truly fraternal society and not see anybody as like extraneous to it? And it's the kind of thing that you maybe see systematized in the Sandinista revolution, you know, where they're like trying to find ways of rehabilitating even Somoza guards and so on, right? They abolished the death penalty immediately. And it's because of that commitment to a certain Christian element in the revolution that says nobody is beyond repair. And I think there's something about that that's like important to say in the right way so that it doesn't get construed as being like, we just accept the bad boss. But it's like, yeah, you might go on strike, but also you hope that your boss like has a change of heart for his or her own good in the end.
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking a lot about that particular passage, or like that outwardly open kind of comportment, in terms of the ongoing culture war and how I experienced that in my own life. And you know, there is, like you mentioned, not to like liberal the whole problem away in the sense of being like, well, oh, everyone's just a human person that you know should be treated with dignity or whatever. But like, how can I guess what's interesting about this is that the particular ethic that Francis gives us is to be like so open to other people that like, you know, your a relationship with them could change the way that they are, and you know, could change the way that you are too. And that is pretty different, I think. And maybe actually might get us somewhere if we invested in that particular way of thinking. Especially with people who don't agree with us politically. I don't know. How do we be open with them, and like how do we kind of believe that we do have some type of fraternity with them, even though they like hate our guts or something? It's a real spiritual practice I don't fully understand, but is definitely something I'm interested in interrogating in my own life, because I feel like, again, I hate to be like the divisions are growing so deep between these two political camps. But the divisions are growing pretty deep between these two political camps, and they're both wrong. And like that, there might be something really worth thinking about with this particular type of openness that people haven't really done or don't understand how to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, like, I mean, there's so much more to say about it, but obviously being nice to people is not going to change the system of global capitalism. I think it's really important to say that, like, that is real. But also, like, I think just for your own spiritual health, you have to find a way to, like, be nice to people. You know what I mean? Like, it can really eat you alive. Like, I always think that there's this line in a poem by Bertolt Brecht. The poem is, like, translated in a bunch of different ways. It's sometimes to those who come after. But there's a line where he says, he's like calling on future generations to kind of look back on the past with some empathy or understanding or forgiveness or grace. And he says, those of us who wish to create a gentle world couldn't be gentle. And it's not said with any pride. It's like, you know, to commit ourselves to the struggle, it hardens you over time. And there's something about that that's really rough. And Boff, even in this book, says he quotes Che Guevara, I think in the beginning of the book, as saying you have to be hard, but you also have to like keep yourself soft. You know, there's this like, or not lose your softness. And I think that's what he's getting at here. That for your own spiritual good, you have to sort of, you know, not let the struggle like turn you into a stone gargoyle or whatever. Even though you know that just being nice isn't going to bring down the boss.
Right. It's true. Being nice won't bring down the boss. But if you do, like, you know, if you take the gospel really seriously in the way that Francis is doing it, right? And you believe in this whole idea of fraternity, that there is like this connection between people, that we're all brothers and siblings. I'm going to try to stop using the gendered language, and I'll say siblings. that we're all related in this like crazy wacky way, right? That like if you really were to think about somebody in that type of like relationality, like you would stop and like give them the time of day and maybe talk it through with them or something, right? In ways that like people are just like not really used to, I think, in these trying times. Like, if your sibling was wrong about something or had a really toxic belief or was exploiting somebody in an awful systemic way, like what you would do as their sibling is probably tell them about it, right? Like, I don't know, harboring a quiet resentment is not like a real way to treat someone who you have a fraternity with. So I don't know. I think it's a challenging but helpful way of thinking about things. Maybe I'll start trying it. Probably not very good at it, but
Yeah, our Twitter doesn't really reflect these values, but maybe later.
maybe later. The Franciscan ethic of being a reply guy is to start telling people we really don't like. Just peace to you. Like, good luck with this. Hoping the best for you. That maybe you'll come around someday. I'm gonna give it a shot and see how it goes.
Yeah, kill him with kindness. There's a lot more to say about it. And fraternity, for Francis, as Boff puts it, is extended even on a cosmic scale, which I think is really cool. We talked about his idea of cosmic democracy, Boff's idea, a long time ago on the Cry the Earth, Cry the Poor episode. So you get that here too. But I want to talk a little bit more about the way he looks at Francis and kind of the seeds of that systemic change as well, or systemic perspective. He has a really interesting bit where he says, one of the global values lived by Francis, together with poverty and minority, is peace. He does not go naively through the world. He knows that it is the regio dissimilitudinous, whatever that means, and that behind the dissimilarities are camouflaged injustices and violence. Especially property maintains strict ties with violence or the loss of inner peace and tranquility. Bishop Guido judged it opportune to advise Francis about the hardness of his life because of the denial of any kinds of goods. Francis responded realistically, Lord, if we had goods, we would need arms to defend them, and from there arise arguments and contentions that in many ways impede the love of God and neighbor. Because of this, we do not want to have anything of our own in this world. And I think that is great as well, right? Maybe it's a counterpoint to what we were just saying, or like a good counterbalance, at least, to that, right? That Francis isn't just sort of doing the nice stuff. He's also committed to a certain way of life because he sees the links between ownership and defensive ownership, right? This is like calling into question the whole ground of capitalist civilization. It's making a link between property and violence. It's, the recognition that the cops are there to protect somebody's store, not to protect the people who are living in a particular neighborhood. So I think that is also a good sort of way to draw out some of that systemic stuff that's happening in St. Francis.
No, I think that's good. And that kind of gets to the heart of like the idea of freedom again in Francis. Like, I'm not willing to play by these rules. I'm going to do my own thing. And that's the bishop is right that there's a type of hardness of that type of life, but undeniably it is definitely free from all of the worst stuff in the world. And that's something pretty cool. Okay, so there's that. There's this emphasis on peace that I think is really important. Dean, you mentioned this thing with the thieves a minute ago. That's in a section of the book called "The Liberating Strategy of Francis," and it's great. This great passage, this great story about the thieves. But let's talk about another great story to kind of round out this conversation about Francis, and that is the Wolf of Gubbio. Maybe that's not how you say that word. I don't know anything about Italian, even a little bit.
You gotta say it the way that Mario would say it.
Now, I think you're setting me up to do racism on this podcast.
No, I'm setting you up to do a Chris Prattism.
Okay, that might be okay. I'm still not going to do it though, for fear of being canceled by unfraternal people in the world. So there's a particular legend, a myth, a story about Francis called the Wolf of Gubbio. And this is what Boff has to say. I'm going to read this longer passage, and I think it's interesting, though. So in this particular story, there is a wolf that is like harassing this town, Gubbio. You know it. It's in Italy. And the people are trying to figure out like what to do about this wolf. It's a big bad wolf. It's blowing your house down. And they're like, please, Francis, come fix this wolf situation for us. And Francis finds a way to negotiate with the wolf in a fraternal way to like sort of stop the harassment. But there's a bit more going on in the story here than just that particular reading, right? I think on one hand, this myth or this like legend, it operates in a way to like demonstrate Francis's like sort of like fraternity with nature and sort of closeness to nature, even to the extent that like Francis could talk down a wolf from like harassing a town, right? But there's something more going on here. Boff wants us to realize. If we look closely, it's not an evil wolf on the one hand and good people on the other. What happens in truth is the use of the wild wolf, great, big, terrible, and ferocious, as the legend paints him. And the other wolf of the city, armed and fearful. In other words, the legend deals with two actors who confront one another and whose only relationship is one of violence and mutual destruction. What's Francis's strategy? His perspective is not to force a truce, a type of balance of strengths inspired by fear. Nor is his strategy one of taking sides. He knows how to avoid. Okay, this is an unfortunate bit of Christian supremacism and like maybe anti-Semitic language. He, Boff says, talking about Francis, knows how to avoid Phariseeism, easily detectable in situations of conflict in which each social agent thinks more or less in the following manner. The evil ones are the others, not I, and so they must be destroyed. People don't question their own position for fear of discovering the evil wolf within themselves, living together in this tension with the good. So Francis's path here is something that's different than like the strict sort of like I'm a good guy, you're a bad guy sense, right? There's a negotiation that it's not just the wolf that is the problem, but it's also the town that is the problem, and that is particularly interesting, right? It's not, again, stressing this extremely pointedly. It's not that like there's a third way. It's not this like that type of thinking, but it's that there's a way to negotiate peace between those two things because they are both opposed in particular ways, right? There's a way to like sublimate that tension that Francis sees, right? It's about not understanding just like the city is good and the wolf is bad, but they're both two wolves, right? They're two wolves to after two different things. The wolf itself is like harassing the townspeople and eating their sheep or whatever, but the town itself is expanding and stretching out and taking the wolf's territory, and these things are both in tension. So I think that that's an interesting way to kind of parse out the way that Francis is a liberating type of character, but also the way that Francis thinks about peace in this like expansive cosmic democracy sort of sense.
Yeah, I like Boff goes on to say too that the liberating challenge is to make new persons from the two types of wolves, which I think is a great way of putting it. And at the end, he says that he converts the wolf into brother wolf, a new being, right? There's like an affirmation of a totally different relationship there between the wolf and the city. And I think that's also a helpful way to avoid the sort of two wolves. And I don't know, this is kind of a weird connection, but I guess it made me sort of think through the utility of something like Marxism as well, because you only get to see the city as a wolf if you kind of understand the structural problems at issue, And that's what Marxism does as well. It sort of says, well, you might think that this person of a different social group is your enemy, but in fact, if you understand that you're both part of the same working class, you're both being oppressed by the same boss, it can help you build some solidarity with one another. It's the recognition of the class struggle that doesn't do away with all the other differences, but allows you to sort of enter into a different liberating relationship with somebody else to try to get something else done. It makes peace, right, as between people in the working class, or at least it should. It doesn't always, but it should make peace such that you can actually find a liberating solution and get justice. So maybe a bit of a stretch, but it just sort of made me think like, what is the unique thing that Francis is perceiving? And it's that sort of deeper logic of violence underneath, right? A deeper sort of reality beyond just like basic enemies. And that's the true success of peace, is to discern what that is and then address it at the root.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that starts to show you some of the resonance between Francis and liberation theology and like how they work together. That like, liberation theology is interested in taking up these systemic types of conversations around evil and sin in the world, and like that's cool, right? It does it through Marxist analysis. But Francis is able to kind of get, not to the same place, obviously, because Francis is not like, you know, a social thinker necessarily. But because of the ways that Francis thinks of the world in a more like flat way, or a more like, you know, with more equality among actors, he's able to do these types of like reversals of perspective that he can see from the perspective of the wolf. The city is also the wolf, right? So that type of equality thinking, equality of action thinking in Francis is what I think lends it towards liberation theology, and what lends it towards, I think, ultimately like a type of like Marxist Christianity as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Boff goes on to say a little bit later, just kind of as we're rounding out this conversation, getting to the end of the hour here, true liberty is realized when an individual has decided to live with all creatures, independent of their situation, serving them courteously, even the animals, as Francis wanted. Because of the freedom that he achieved for himself, St. Francis encourages all the true processes of liberation that search, by means of solidarity action, to create and to widen the arena of liberty. I think that's the key, right? Is to to widen that arena of freedom, and to widen it even to your enemies. That the goal is to, you know, you want to win, obviously, but the goal is not really the defeat of your enemies. The goal is a situation where as many people as possible can live in a truly free and healthy and good relationship, which doesn't preclude real struggle. I mean, as Boff himself was willing to affirm, right? Affirming all kinds of different struggles that, like, unfortunately were violent in Latin America. But it does mean sort of a desire to get to a horizon that is peaceful for as many people as possible by the time you get there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not about winning a struggle. It's about like, I don't know, like the story, like it's about becoming new types of people, right? About people who understand one another better, or who share some type of fraternity that they didn't before. That's winning is like the winning move is to like make sure you don't have to play the game at all. I guess for Francis, right?
Yeah.
Sidestepping it all. Cool. Well, the conclusion then
Yeah.
of this chapter is just kind of some rearticulation, but I think it's worth getting out there. So Boff says that the gospel seriousness of Francis is surrounded by lightheartedness and enchantment, because it's profoundly imbued with joy, refinement, courtesy, and humor. There's in him an invincible confidence in humanity and in the merciful goodness of the Father. As a result, he exercises all fears and threats. His faith does not alienate him from the world, nor does it lead him to a pure valley of tears. On the contrary, it transforms him through gentleness and care, in land and home for the fraternal encounter where persons do not appear as children of necessity, but with children as joy, which is a Gaston Bachelard quote. Love some Bachelard. He's a great guy. Well, I don't know if he's a great guy, but he wrote a book that I do like. Okay, anyways, and then Boff finishes it out saying, we can dance in the world because it's the theater of the glory of God and of his children. Francis of Assisi, more than an idea, is a spirit and a way of life. The spirit and way of life are only made manifest in practice, not in a formula, idea, or ideal. Everything in Francis invites practice, leaving the imperial system in an alternative act that makes real more devotion toward others, more gentleness with the poor, and greater respect for nature. So we've gotten here to the conclusion, Dean, of this chapter in this book. Do you think that Leonardo Boff is right? Is St. Francis the guy for liberation theology?
Well, you could do a lot worse. And like I said, the Dominicans didn't write a book about Dominic. The Jesuits didn't write a book about Ignatius. So far, Francis is the winner by default. But, you know, for all the kind of gaps aside, and I think maybe if there's one error of this past hour of conversation, maybe we've just tried really hard to build bridges that maybe can't sustain the weight of analogy that Boff has kind of tried to place here. But I do think that at the end, right, Francis is more than an idea. Francis of Assisi is a spirit and a way of life. And that is that sort of cosmic fraternity, right, with everybody. That does seem like the goal to which liberation theologians are striving, even if they don't seem very Franciscan, or even if they seem a little more fiery, or a little more crabby or cantankerous, as some of them can be. The end goal is still the kind of peace that Francis is after. And I don't know, sure, I'll take it. Francis, he's a great saint for liberation theology. Why not? I don't know. What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I think he's a okay, this is how I feel. Liberation theology, sometimes we come to this conclusion on the podcast that like in a lot of ways it ends up being more radical than Marxism because it like thinks that you have to become a new type of person and that like all people have to become some kind of new type of person, right? Different than like the dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever. more expansive and like deep reaching. And I think that this is also, I think, in that same vein, or it gives me that same feeling, right? That like Marxism is a great idea. It's a great social philosophy. Workers should own the means of production. We love it, of course. And liberation theology is speaking towards like a type of character in people that is really difficult to cultivate. And Francis is giving you something that's even harder, I think, than that, right? It's like, do you want to really be invested in becoming a new person? Well, here's at least one way that one wild guy thought about it in like the 1500s or whatever, and you have to think of like all things as your sibling in this very serious way. And I think it lends itself to liberation theology and like you said, maybe it falls apart in some places, and that's okay. But it offers like something very difficult, but I think maybe spiritually useful in life that I think is worth considering.
Yeah, so there you have it. The next time you're really mad at somebody, you can say the prayer of St. Francis, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't go on strike, but it means you should, don't let that hatred eat you alive. Try to come up with some great, miraculous solution, and that solution will probably be do still go on strike, but
and then get your boss to go on strike with you.
Yeah, exactly. Get everybody on strike. Let's get the whole world on strike. And then when everybody's not working, we can finally really see each other outside the law. And we can say, Dad, too bad. I'm a citizen of God and I'm not going to listen to what your lawyers have to say. And we'll finally live in the big world commune that St. Francis was dreaming of.
Can you imagine showing up to work, though, and you're like extremely late and your boss is like, I'm sorry, you're not getting paid today. And it's like, sorry, I live outside the law. I live outside the law. I only listen to God, and I'm on time, I think.
You know, the worst part is if that boss had any religious literacy, they'd be like, well, then you'll be glad to know that St. Francis also didn't allow his followers to have any money. So goodbye.
Oh, no. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. At $1 or more, maybe $2, I can't remember which it is, you can join the Magnificast Discord channel, and you're going to love it. Being in there, talking to people, learning about them. It's great. You'll learn a whole bunch of things about people you've never met before. And what more could you really want? Hey, also, here's a fun thing. There are 2 new pieces of Magnificast merchandise on our Redbubble store that you can go buy or not. I don't care if you buy them. I made them regardless of you buying them. So you just do what you want with that information. Maybe you can buy a sticker, maybe you can buy a button, maybe you can buy a t-shirt, or maybe you could do none of those things and just live your life as a regular person. That's fine and great without any t-shirts. Listen, St. Francis, he didn't have one of our t-shirts, and I think he was pretty great. So maybe you don't need one. Actually talking you out of it at this point. All right. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by Theological Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have